Nature American Spring Live on KRWG Public Media, April 29th, 30th, and May 1st at 7 p.m. More at pbs.org/American Spring Live. Major support for Nature American Spring Live and this related local programming was provided by the National Science Foundation and the Anne Ray Foundation. Park Williams studies climate, in particular the causes of drought and the effects of climate change on forests. He travels all over, from the western United States all the way to Ethiopia, and drills into trees to discover their past. Using tree rings and other data, he can see how the climate changed over time and how the trees responded. His work helped show a strong connection between the warming climate and the increase in wildfires in the West. I'm very pleased to welcome to Issues and Answers Park Williams of Columbia University. Park, it's so good to have you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you for being here. Let's start talking about your research and how you established this very important information, this connection between climate change and more wildfires.
Sure. In the United States, we're lucky to have really good data on climate over the last century and on fire over the last 40 to 50 years. And so while fire is a pretty chaotic process on any given day, for example, you can have a small fire become a very large fire for any number of reasons. When we compare fire data from year to year to climate data from year to year, we see very clearly exactly what you'd expect, and that is that in forests in the western United States, the drier years are the years with more fire, and that relationship is actually extremely strong. So if we know what the climate was in any given year, we know how much fire there should have been or how much fire there would have been in any given year. And when we drill into the data even further, we find that of all the different drought-related variables, temperature is the one that's the most important. The hot years are the big fire years. And we can see that over the last 50 years or so, as climate in the western U.S. has increased by over 2 degrees Fahrenheit, as temperature has increased by over 2 degrees Fahrenheit, that wildfire area in forests has increased at the exact predicted rate based on the relationship between temperature and fire.
And we're talking about a big area here. I mean, I was stunned to learn that your research shows about half of the wildfires that we've seen in recent years in the West can be attributed to climate change. We're talking about an area burned the size of Massachusetts and New Hampshire combined, right?
Yes. So since the early 1980s, when our data on wildfire area becomes very precise from satellite records, we see that the area of forest burned in any given year has increased by over 1,000%, meaning there's more than 10 times more forest fire area today than there was 30 or 40 years ago. And if we use the relationship between climate and fire, to predict how much fire there would be in a given year based on climate, we can then estimate how much fire there should have been if the warming trend over the last century had never occurred. And what we find is there, of course, still would have been fire, but there only would have been about half as much forest fire area over the last 40 to 50 years or 30 to 40 years than we actually saw.
One of the great pieces of information I learned from looking at your faculty websites, another piece of information was a link to a video from Columbia University, and in that video you say that the impact of your research really comes down to policy. What are we going to do about climate change now that we know this information through your research, the research of others? What should we do?
I think we can think about our response to climate change in two ways. And so there are two very critical things. One, of course, is proactivity. And that means we actually have been given quite a privilege by our knowledge to understand the relationship between our emissions of greenhouse gases and climate. And given that, we know more or less how climate is going to go over the next century. We at least have a pretty good idea of how much it's going to warm over the next century. And if we don't want that, we actually have time to do stuff about it. And so for one, reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, and two, perhaps some geoengineering techniques where we take more proactive measures to reduce the temperature of the Earth, maybe by increasing the reflectivity of the atmosphere, which is a pretty dangerous idea right now, but something that's on the table. So who's going to do it? Is there going to be some decree that comes from nowhere to tell the entire globe that everybody needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? No. Is everybody just going to do it because it feels like the right thing to do? No. It's going to be a response to a global economy. And here, the United States actually holds a pretty big axe. The United States is one of the global leaders economically, and when we decide to make a change in policy, then the rest of the world responds. And so when we hear politicians say, well, it's actually not worth it for the United States to do anything about greenhouse gas emissions because that would only reduce the global temperature by 0.2 degrees Celsius, which is hardly anything. My response is, that's not necessarily true. If the United States decides to begin valuing solar technology and wind energy technology more, then that's going to affect the global economy in a way that makes those things more valuable. And other countries will follow in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. So that's on the proactive side. The reactive side is also very important. No matter what we do, the globe is going to continue warming for the next century and beyond. Even if we stop burning fossil fuels today, the globe will continue warming for several more centuries. And so that means that climate is certain to change. And so beyond thinking about how to slow the warming, we need to be thinking about how we're going to adapt. And of course, there are many different ways to adapt, but we need to recognize that the warming that we've seen over the last century is only going to continue and accelerate in the future.
Very important to know. And we've talked about one of the effects, fire. I want to talk about another one that a lot of people watching this show right now want me to ask this question, and I would have asked it anyway. But let's talk about water. How will climate change impact the already stressed water supplies, not just here, but all over the Southwest? And how is this already impacting us?
Climate models suggest that as the globe warms, then the dry subtropics, the dry areas of, say, Mexico here in North America, are to migrate north. And there are two reasons why the Southwest is expected to become drier, and indeed it has already become drier. One reason is because of reduced precipitation during the fall and especially during the spring. And two is because of increased temperatures. Just like in our houses, how if we leave wet laundry out, the laundry will dry out more if we have the heater on. The globe dries stuff out. The atmosphere can dry out plants and litter on the ground faster in a warm year than in a cool year.
Yeah. And evaporation. We've seen that with our reservoir, Elephant Butte, where it has gone down to as low as about 3% of capacity.
Right. And so globally, the human-caused climate change process is not going to dry out all of the continents the same. Some places will in fact get wetter because the atmosphere holds more water in a warmer world, and that means more precipitation in some places. But the Southwest is one of the only places on the globe where we have a really high degree of confidence that it's going to dry out. It's going to dry out because of the lack of precipitation, and also because of increased temperatures, which drive an increased evaporative demand from the atmosphere.
So we have to prepare for this. Most people don't realize that agriculture uses most of the water in many places in the Southwest, including right here. We're told 85 to 90% of the water in this area used by agriculture. And yet, we see very high water use crops like pecan trees growing in popularity, not planting fewer of them, but growing in popularity because they're high value on the market. What do you make of this?
What we decide to grow for agriculture is pretty detached from the reality of long-term water supply. So in the Western United States, there are a couple sources of water. There's the water that falls out of the sky every year, and then there's the water that we can mine from the ground. And during droughts, we have been lucky to be able to use water that's in the ground in order to not suffer because of droughts. But if we look at long-term records of how much water is in the ground, we can measure this simply by looking to see how deep people need to dig wells in order to tap into the aquifer. We can see that in the southwestern U.S. and across a lot of the United States, ground water levels have been going down. And even so, here in southern New Mexico, we had really bad drought conditions from 2011 through 2014, and so there was a big drop in groundwater. Since then, the climate has actually been wetter, but groundwater levels haven't really recovered. And the reason is because we're using more groundwater than ever. And the reason for that largely is because of agricultural usage. And so if during a drought and after a drought we decide that growing more water intensive crops is smarter than growing less water intensive or more water efficient crops, then that means that we're making our decisions not based on the amount of water, but instead based on the price of water. And if we continue to drive water levels down in the ground by growing very water inefficient crops, that probably means that water is too cheap. It's too easy to access, and in accessing it in an unsustainable rate, we're just stealing from the future. And so the farmer that decides to grow the high value crop must be doing that because they've decided that rather than pass the farm on from generation to generation in the future with a sustainable water table, they decided, well, the water table is going down anyway because everybody's over extracting, so I'm just going to get in now and pass down the money from the pecans rather than the farm itself.
Okay. Very important information, and hopefully some elected officials are listening right now. Before fires, or rather besides fires and the lack of water, damaging our forests, there's another issue here. It makes it harder to fight climate change. I know that you say in the U.S. alone, about 20% of our annual carbon emissions are offset by tree growth in the forests, right?
So and globally, we see that plants on continents gobble up about 25% of our global carbon dioxide emissions. And the oceans take up another 25%. And those two reservoirs do us a huge favor because they cut in half the amount of carbon dioxide that is going into the atmosphere every year. And as we go into the future, an important uncertainty in how climate is going to change is whether or not continents are going to continue doing us this favor of gobbling up carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. If continents become more productive, meaning more forests photosynthesizing faster, then that does us the favor of causing carbon dioxide to accumulate in the atmosphere more slowly. But if instead we have massive die-offs of forests and conversion of large carbon-rich forests into more sparsely vegetated landscapes like shrublands and grass that we see throughout the Southwest, then we go in the opposite way of the global warming problem actually getting exacerbated by a loss of carbon from the land surface.
I wanted to bring that up because I don't know that it's a widely understood phenomenon, and when people hear about conservation and hear about the importance of maintaining our forests, this is a really concrete way to explain this that's very important to understand. Along these lines, this is a really interesting time when we talk about climate change politics. On one hand, you see states like New Mexico taking bold action, passing legislation just this year to have carbon-free electric generation in the next few decades. They vastly sped up the process through legislation to do that. But on the other hand, at the federal level, you see a simple resolution, not even legislation to do anything specifically or money placed on anything, but the Green New Deal. It was a resolution saying, hey, we have a problem. Here are some things that we might look at with legislation in the future. And it caused this enormous political storm It was used as a political weapon, actually, against any Democrat who might want to even think about supporting the Green New Deal. Well, what do you make of this?
The decisions made in Washington, I think, are made in a reactive way, where I guess I see politicians as rather than being real people with real opinions, they're reacting and playing a game, and taking the path of least resistance toward a position that they want.
They're certainly not reading your papers, probably.
No, they're definitely not reading papers. And so I guess where I'm going with that is that the way that you affect this personalityless creature that is the political environment in Washington is by changing the opinion of regular Americans. And in terms of climate change, it just means having them educated. And so being able to talk to people. And right now, climate change is not a top 5 issue among the United States public, and it probably never will be. But if we have a public that all agrees that it is that, or say 90% of the public understands that when you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the globe warms, and as a result, the environment is going to change, and the distribution of water is going to change, and the distribution of forests will change. If you have a public that just accepts this as reality, then it doesn't need to be a top 5 issue. It's kind of like gravity. Politicians don't need to debate the existence of gravity. It's just something we accept.
Yeah, so let's get to that. About changing minds. A recent Gallup poll, I thought this was very interesting, found about 66% of Americans believe global warming is caused by human activity. So that is near an all-time high, 66%. But that still means about 1/3 of Americans don't believe established science.
Right. And that's but we're trending in the right direction.
We are.
It is very interesting. There are two points here that I find interesting. One is a lot of the people who don't think that climate change is human caused actually live in a part of the country where warming hasn't been all that severe. So the southeastern United States and Midwest both have not warmed all that much. And the reasons for that we're still trying to sort out. But if you look at the globe, it actually stands out like a sore thumb that this is one of the only parts of the globe that hasn't really warmed. And so people are responding, people are smart, and they're responding to their own life experience. And when it begins warming faster in those areas, they'll be quicker to accept.
And another positive thing, you talked about, and we should be positive because it is near an all-time high, 66% who believe in established science on this. There's also another reason for hope. I mean, here in Las Cruces and all over the world, we have seen marches for science, that people go out and beyond climate change, there are other issues, go out and it reflects the concerns that many Americans have about these issues and about protecting science from politics. Trying to do that.
Right. Yeah.
And this is important. I mean, I don't know that everyone realizes the funding, a lot of the funding for the work that you do and many other scientists do comes from the federal government.
Right. And the relationship between science and politics is really complicated. One, because we scientists do work that is not valued by a lot of people on a day-to-day basis, meaning that the public isn't seeing reason to fund science directly. And so this is the reason we have governments, is in order to fund things that are best for the greater good over the long term, even if people don't see the value today.
And you make the point, we need more drought research. We need to do more of it.
Sure. Well, so science has settled that the globe warms when you put more CO2 in the atmosphere. This isn't the first time this has happened on geologic timescales. When more CO2 goes in the atmosphere, the globe warms. One of the most exciting and interesting and important realms of human-caused climate change is what's going to happen to water. Some places are going to get wetter, some places are going to get drier. Hardly anywhere is going to stay the same. But if you travel across any continent, you'll see the predominant reason why the scenery changes from place to place is water availability. What can grow where, what can live where is dependent on water. And so as the distribution of water changes across the planet, life changes as a result. And that those changes don't stop at just forests and animals, they'll affect humans specifically. And so we need to know more about how climate change affects water availability.
Okay, Park Williams, he is from Columbia University. Park, thank you so much for sharing some of your work here today and important information about drought, fire, and climate change.
Thank you.
Nature American Spring Live on KRWG Public Media, April 29th, 30th, and May 1st at 7 p.m. More at pbs.org/American Spring Live. Major support for Nature American Spring Live and this related local programming was provided by the National Science Foundation and the Anne Ray Foundation.